To understand why Roman authority collapsed in the West, we must begin not with barbarian invasions, but with the geography of empire. Rome did not fall because it lacked power. It fell because it possessed too much territory to control for too long. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the Scottish borderlands to the Sahara. This vastness had once been Rome's greatest triumph. It brought security, trade, prestige, and a sense of universal order. But it also imposed an impossible burden. Every mile of frontier had to be defended, supplied, administered, and patrolled. An empire built through conquest now had to survive through endurance. The Roman frontiers were not natural walls. They were long, porous zones of contact, especially along the Rhine and Danube, where Roman soldiers, merchants, diplomats, and foreign peoples interacted daily. These frontiers required constant vigilance. When pressure increased at one point, troops had to be shifted from another. Defense became a matter of redistribution, not reinforcement. This system worked only as long as the empire retained surplus manpower and decisive central authority. By late antiquity, it had neither. Earlier emperors understood the danger of overstretch. Augustus himself warned against further expansion, recognizing that Rome had reached the limits of what it could securely hold. Yet the imperial structure remained locked into the logic of scale. Retreat was politically unthinkable. To abandon territory was to admit weakness, and weakness invited rebellion. The result was a defensive strategy that depended increasingly on compromise rather than control. Instead of excluding hostile peoples from imperial territory, Roman authorities settled them inside the empire as foederati, armed allies who defended frontiers in exchange for land and autonomy. This was not initially a sign of desperation. It was a pragmatic solution to manpower shortages, but it altered the character of Roman power in subtle and dangerous ways. Rome was no longer defending its borders with Roman citizens bound by civic loyalty. It was defending itself with foreign war bands loyal primarily to their own leaders. At the same time, the Roman army itself was changing. Military service had once been a defining feature of Roman citizenship. By the 4th century, it had become a profession increasingly detached from civilian society. Soldiers lived apart, trained apart, and identified more with their units and commanders than with the state. The army became a self-contained institution, powerful but politically volatile. This professional army consumed enormous resources. Maintaining troops along multiple frontiers required heavy taxation, which strained an already fragile economy. As revenue declined, the state struggled to pay and supply its soldiers. Commanders compensated by promising land, plunder, or political favor, further weakening the link between army and empire. Nowhere were these weaknesses more apparent than along the Danube frontier. This region served as the gateway into Italy and the western provinces. Roman defenses here were thinly stretched, divided between eastern and western administrations, and vulnerable to large-scale movements of peoples fleeing pressure from the Huns. When the Visigoths crossed the Danube in 376, they did so not as invaders, but as refugees seeking protection. Rome admitted them, then failed to feed, control, or integrate them. The consequences were catastrophic. The Gothic revolt that followed exposed the hollowness of Roman military power. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378, a Roman field army was annihilated and an emperor killed. More damaging than the loss itself was what it revealed. Rome could no longer decisively impose its will on its own frontiers. From this point onward, the empire was reacting rather than commanding. Military resources were spread too thin to prevent incursions everywhere. Each new crisis weakened defenses elsewhere. When Alaric's Visigoths eventually entered Italy, they did so not because Rome lacked armies, but because Rome lacked strategic depth and unity. The Western Empire, poorer and less urbanized than the East, was especially vulnerable. The Eastern Empire could afford to prioritize certain frontiers and abandon others. The West could not. Its survival depended on Italy, yet Italy itself was exposed by failures along the Danube. When that line failed, the heart of the empire lay open. What we see then is not a sudden military defeat, but a systemic exhaustion. Rome had expanded beyond the limits of sustainable defense. Its frontiers became liabilities rather than protections. Military solutions that once guaranteed dominance now accelerated decline. In this sense, barbarian invasions were not the cause of Rome's fall, they were the symptom. The empire collapsed under the weight of its own scale. It had conquered the world, but it could no longer hold it.